the national government and the 50 states. Have you ever really focused on the words United States? The United States is a union of states, the several states joined together, the States United. The Constitution created and is intended to preserve the Union. To that end, the Constitution, 1, guarantees the national government, or rather requires the national government to guarantee certain things to the states, and 2, makes it possible for the national government to do certain things for the states. In this section, you're going to need to know the meanings of the following words: Enabling Act, Act of Admission, Grants and Aid Program, Revenue Sharing, Categorical Grant, Block Grant, and Project Grant. The nation's obligations to the states. The Constitution places several obligations on the national government for the benefit of the states. Most of these are found in Article 4. The Constitution requires the national government to guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. The Constitution does not define republican form of government, and the Supreme Court has regularly refused to do so. The term is generally understood to mean a representative government. The Supreme Court has held that the question of whether a state has a republican form of government is a political question. That is, it is one to be decided by the political branches of the government, the President and the Congress, and not by the courts. The only extensive use ever made of the republican form guarantee came in the years immediately following the Civil War. Congress declared that several southern states did not have governments of a republican form. It refused to admit senators and representatives from those states until the states had ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and broadened their laws to recognize the voting and other rights of African Americans. The Constitution states that the national government must also protect each of them, the states, against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. Article 4, Section 4. Today it is clear that any invasion of the United States will be met as an attack on the United States for the states and for the national government itself. This constitutional guarantee is therefore now of little, if any, significance. This was not the case in the late 1780s. During that time, it was not at all certain that all 13 states would stand together if a foreign power attacked one of them. So, before the 13 states agreed to give up their war-making powers, each demanded an ironclad pledge that an attack on any single state would be met as an attack on all states. The federal system assumes that each of the 50 states will keep the peace within its own borders. Thus, the primary responsibility for curbing insurrection, riot, or other internal disorder rests with the individual states. However, the Constitution does accept that a state might not be able to control some situations. It therefore guarantees protection against internal disorder, or what the Constitution calls domestic violence, in each of them. The use of federal force to restore order within a state has historically been a rare event. Several instances did occur in the 1960s, however, when racial unrest exploded into violence in Detroit during the long, hot summer of 1967. President Lyndon Johnson ordered units of the United States Army into the city. He acted at the request of the governor of Michigan, George Romney, and only after Detroit's police and firefighters, supported by state police and National Guard units, could not control riots, arson, and looting in the city. In 1968, against the request of the governors involved, federal troops were sent into Chicago and Baltimore to help put down the violence that erupted following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Normally, a president has sent troops into states only to answer a request from its governor or legislature. If national laws are being broken, national functions interfered with, or national property endangered, however, a president does not need to wait for such a pledge. The ravages of nature, storms, floods, drought, forest fires, and such, can be more destructive than human violence. Here, too, acting to protect the states against domestic violence, the federal government stands ready to aid stricken areas. The national government is constitutionally bound to respect the territorial integrity of each of the states. That is, the national government must recognize the legal existence and the physical boundaries of each state. The basic scheme of the Constitution imposes this obligation. Several of its provisions do so as well. For example, Congress must include in both of its houses members chosen in each one of the states. Recall, too, that Article 5 of the Constitution declares that no state can be deprived of its equal representation in the United States Senate without its own consent. Only Congress has the power to admit new states to the Union. As part of the national government's guarantee of respect for each state's territorial integrity, the Constitution places only one restriction on that power. A new state cannot be created by taking territory from one or more of the existing states without the consent of the legislatures of the states involved. Congress has admitted 37 states since the original 13 formed the Union. 5 states, Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maine, and West Virginia, were created from parts of already existing states. Texas was an independent republic before admission. California was admitted shortly after being ceded to the United States by Mexico. Each of the other 30 states entered the Union only after a longer period of time, frequently more than 15 years, as an organized territory. The process of admission to the Union is usually fairly simple. The area desiring statehood first asks Congress for admission. If and when Congress chooses to pass an enabling act, an act directing the people of the territory to frame a proposed state constitution, a convention prepares the constitution, which is then put to a popular vote in the proposed state. If the voters approve the constitution, it is submitted to Congress for its consideration. If Congress still agrees to statehood after reviewing the document, it passes an act of admission, an act creating the new state. If the President signs the act, the new state enters the Union. The 2 newest states, Alaska and Hawaii, shortened the usual process of gaining admission to the Union. Each adopted a proposed constitution without waiting for an enabling act. Hawaii in 1950 and Alaska in 1956. Both became states in 1959. Before finally admitting a new state, Congress has often set certain conditions. For example, in 1896, Utah was admitted on condition that its constitution outlaw polygamy, the practice of having more than one spouse at a time. In the act admitting Alaska to the Union as the 49th state, Congress forever prohibited the state from claiming title to any lands legally held by any Native American. Each state enters the Union on an equal footing with each of the other states. Thus, although Congress can set certain conditions, like those just described, it cannot impose conditions of a political nature on the states. For example, when Oklahoma was admitted to the Union in 1907, Congress said the state could not remove its capital from Guthrie to any other place before 1913. In 1910, however, the Oklahoma legislature moved the state's capital to Oklahoma City. When this step was challenged, the United States Supreme Court held in Coyle v. Smith, 1911, that Congress set conditions for prospective state admission, but the court also held that conditions cannot be enforced when they compromise the independence of a state to manage its own internal affairs. Consider one more example. President William Taft voted a resolution to admit Arizona to the Union in 1911. He did so because Arizona's proposed constitution provided that members of the state's judiciary could be removed from office, by popular vote. This provision meant, said Taft, that a judge would have to keep one eye on the law and the other on public opinion. In response to Taft's concern, Arizona removed the recall section from the document. In 1912, Congress passed, and the President signed, another act of admission for Arizona. Almost immediately after admission, however, the new state amended its new constitution to provide for the recall of judges. That provision remains a part of the Arizona's constitution today. Cooperative federalism. As you know, federalism produces a dual system of government in which states are divided between the states and the federal government. You have also read that as a result of this complex agreement, competition, tensions, and conflicts are a regular part of American federalism. In short, the American governmental system is like a tug of war, a continuing power struggle between the national government and the states, with the Supreme Court acting as referee or umpire. On the other hand, the American federal system also involves a broad area of shared powers. That is, in addition to the two separate spheres of power held and exercised by the two basic levels of government, there are large and growing areas of cooperation between them. These areas include funds that the federal government grants to the states, as well as various services that the states perform for the federal government. Federal grants and aid. Perhaps the best known examples of this intergovernmental cooperation are the many federal grants and aid programs. Grants of federal money or other resources to the states and their cities, counties, and other local units. Many of these governments are regularly strapped for funds. These grants often help them perform a large share of their everyday functions. The history of grants and aid programs goes back more than 200 years to the period before the Constitution. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Congress under the Articles of Confederation provided for the government of the territory beyond the Ohio River. Looking forward to the existence of new states on that frontier, the Congress set aside sections of land for the support of public education in those future states. On through the 19th century, states received grants of federal lands for a number of purposes: schools and colleges, roads and canals, flood control work, and several others. A large number of the major state universities, for example, were founded as land-grant colleges. These schools were built with money obtained from the sale of public lands given to the states by the Morrill Act of 1862. Congress began to make grants of federal money quite early, too. In 1808, it gave the states $200,000 to support the militia. Cash grants did not come to play a large role, however, until the Depression years of the 1930s. Many of the New Deal programs aimed at bringing the nation out of an economic crisis were built around grants of money. Since then, Congress has set up hundreds of grants and aids programs. In fact, more than 500 are now in operation. Dozens of programs function in a variety of areas: in education, mass transit, highway construction, healthcare, on-the-job training, and many others. Grants and aid are based on the national government's taxing power. The Constitution gives Congress that power in order, quote, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, end quote. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Today, these grants total more than $250 billion and account for some 25% of all state and local government spending each year. These grants make it possible for the federal government to cooperate in many policy areas in which it would otherwise have no constitutional authority. For example, in such fields as education, low-income housing, local law enforcement, and mental health. In this way, grants and aids blur the line of division of powers of the federal government. One form of federal government aid, known as revenue sharing, was in place from 1972 to 1987. Under this program, Congress gave an annual share of the huge federal tax revenue to the states and their cities, counties, and townships. Altogether, those shared revenues amounted to more than $83 billion over the years the program was in force. Virtually no strings were attached to the money. In fact, Congress placed only a major restriction on the use of funds. The money could not be spent for any program in which the discrimination on the basis of race, sex, national origin, age, religion, belief, or physical disability was evident. Otherwise, the shared revenues could be used very largely as the states and other local units chose to spend them. Needless to say, revenue sharing was quite popular and strongly supported by many governors, mayors, and other state and local officials. It was opposed by the Ronald Reagan administration, however, and fell victim to the financial needs of the debt-ridden national government. Various efforts to revive revenue sharing in today's more prosperous climate have not yet won significant support in Congress, at least to this point in time.